As somebody who's been into collecting video games and other items for the majority of my childhood and adult life, I've always been attracted to stories about collectors and stories about how collecting was integrated into their lives. Now, recently I came across an article in the New York Times about an old woman in New York City. She recently passed away at 88. And her passion was opera, and specifically getting hundreds and hundreds of pieces of memorabilia autographed by opera singers. She had no children. She lived in a rent-controlled apartment, and from about 1960 until the mid-2010s, she had attended 300 performances, musical performances at primarily the Metropolitan Opera House, but also other venues per year. Again, that's per year from the 1960s until the mid-2010s. It's an incredible amount of opera going. And what she would do is, after the performances, she would just kind of hang out backstage, find her way backstage, and kind of collect all of these autographs on various pieces of memorabilia. Now, in the article, one of the interesting things that they discussed was that in the process of doing this, she found ways to avoid paying full price for her tickets. So she would kind of time the performances in such a way that she would get her tickets from scalpers right before the start of the show. She would take only standing room seats at the top of the opera house. And eventually she developed personal relationships with ticket takers and ushers and the management of the place. And she was able to get into a number of performances for free. She would sneak food in so she didn't have to buy anything there, and she'd take public transportation. So she really, throughout her whole life, just limited her cost to see all of these great performances. Now, the question is, what does this have to do with video games, and specifically retro game collecting? And I think quite a lot. As I was reading this article and just reading about her life, and then they showed pictures of her apartment, this kind of like rundown, shabby room with boxes and boxes and boxes that stood as a monument to her collecting, it occurred to me that this way that she developed of subverting the economics of opera to enjoy as much opera as possible is actually a central feature of extreme or hyper hobbyist culture. And I think that's the culture that we are all engaged in to some extent or another. And I think in retro gaming, it is a type of, hyper devotion, hyper fan, obsessive collecting culture. And I would argue that it's a culture that's only made possible by subverting the prevailing economies of gaming to develop what I'll call the panoptic perspective, a wide-ranging historical appreciation for gaming as a genre. And that sounds maybe a little elitist or maybe a little complex, but in its most basic form, I think we as gamers actually work like this woman. We're limiting our costs to get as wide-ranging an experience of the object that we love as we possibly can. And I think there are three specific ways that we as retro gamers and gaming collectors do that. So the first way, I think, is clearly just the elapsed time discount, the sense that, especially with the rise of eBay, if you just wait until a system is no longer produced, games start dropping in price, you can just simply buy more games than you could have at the peak of the system. And it's kind of like a U-shaped curve. It's been pretty consistent throughout gaming, where system comes out, it's hot, it's popular, and then interest dwindles. And we're seeing that now with Wii U, Xbox 360. Games drop in price, obviously from MSRP, or sometimes you look for them on sale, Black Friday, things like that. And then you're able as a consumer to kind of flex your dollar, take your dollar further, and engage in a type of consumer practice that was restricted when the system was popular. And I think that's, as somebody who got into retro gaming on eBay via eBay, basically, that was the appeal. When I was a kid, I couldn't afford 10 Sega Genesis games, but I could buy that lot for $30 or $40. This was a number of years ago. Going to garage sales, finding, as I did, a Sega Master System complete in box with 5 games. I remember seeing it as a kid, could never afford it, but hey, for $10, I could easily afford it. So, in a certain sense, waiting and particularly using eBay back before the kind of current insanity on eBay with the prices, it became a way to be that one percenter, that kid who got everything back in the 80s and 90s. Well, if you waited until 2005, 2006, you could kind of be that kid. And again, that's necessary for expanding your perspective and really enjoying all that a system has to offer. I think another way that quite clearly contributes to the hyperfan culture, the expertise, the panoptic perspective is emulation. And obviously, emulation has its proponents, has its detractors, but I think emulation really has been one of the ways to fully develop your taste and your sense of history. And that takes the subversion to a new level, because now you're not just getting games at a great discount, you're getting the whole catalog of games for free and play it on your computer, all sorts of different ways to enjoy emulation. And also, you can buy the compilations and things like that relied on emulation. But this is a way for you to do something that you could really never do back in the day, and that is to play or to own or have all of the games on the NES, all of the games on the Super NES, in 300, 400, 500 megabytes. And obviously, at the start of this, it was hard to find these things, but now, through archives on the internet, it literally is just a click away. And that's not only economic subversion relative to what these games cost back in the day, but also real economic subversion now, because, listen, some of these games are sold to you through the PlayStation Store, the various eShops, and of course, the eShop is an example, and its iteration on the 3DS, Wii U, and now the Switch, with Nintendo forcing you, if you wanted to play by the rules, to buy all of these games multiple times. Well, if you really want to enjoy the Nintendo library in all of its glory, with no omissions, you have to emulate. And then I think related to that, the third way that we're seeing this is console hacks, whether it's ODEs, EverDrives, repos, custom firmwares, basically technologies that allow you to have your original hardware and still explore all of these libraries. And kind of the question that comes up is, are there ethical issues here? What are the positives? What are the negatives? So, I'll start with the negative. Yes, I think in a real way, you're not supporting the industry that you purport to love. You're not supporting the developers who created these pieces of software and these objects that we all love. Now, some of these developers have moved on. Some of them are out of business. But listen, if you love Nintendo, you could make the argument that you should support Nintendo. And if you really love Earthbound and you want to play it again, but you have the Switch and you don't want to hook up your Wii U, you got to purchase it on the Switch, or you got to get the whatever that Nintendo subscription is. So I think that's part of it. I would argue that the positives outweigh that. So this panoptic perspective that I'm talking about, the breadth of experience in video games, is not necessarily for everyone. Like, I get that everyone does not necessarily want to have experienced the whole history of gaming, but certainly the passionate collectors and the influencers on YouTube have used that perspective and used that expertise to create mind share generally for gaming. And that has become an economic driver, and in some senses has resuscitated certain IPs that may have gone dormant. So a couple of examples that just come to mind. The Happy Console Gamer has been talking about the Ease series for quite some time, and those games started to be released on the Vita, the PlayStation 4. Is he solely responsible for that? Well, not really, but he created a mind share around that series, and now they're trickling out and being translated instead of just remaining in Japan. Since I mentioned Earthbound, obviously we've never gotten the Earthbound sequel that we wanted here in the West, but Nintendo has, put those characters in Smash. They had the amiibos. They translated the first NES game, and I think it was on the Wii U where you could buy it. And so I think had there been no online culture that really educated people as to why this was a great game, you wouldn't have seen those products from Nintendo. Now, there's a myriad other examples, but I think, it's key that the people who have garnered this perspective, I think, help the gaming industry and probably drive sales to certain IPs that may have not otherwise been there. I think the other thing from a historical perspective is that the economic models in place for certain games and certain systems didn't allow you to fully appreciate those games and systems. So I think the example here really would be the Neo Geo. You think about the fact that only the 1% could really own the Neo Geo. Back in the day, it was whatever it was, $650, $200 for the games. So that wasn't available to the average consumer. The average consumer experienced Neo Geo in the arcades. And of course, in the arcades, you were limited to whatever change you had in your pocket. So it wasn't until there were ways to emulate and other means to play the Neo Geo, whether it's a compilation or consoleized MVS or things like that, where you could explore the whole library and you saw how brilliant it was. Sega Saturn is another example of that, where you have these great shmups. Right now they're hundreds to thousands of dollars, but thanks to these technologies, there are ways to play and enjoy them, and you're seeing the brilliance of these systems. Now, what's interesting to me is kind of also the question of, is this going away? I think with modern gaming, the ability to develop that panoptic fan perspective is not as readily available. So I think gaming as a service, sort of these different gaming platforms, there are no discounts to be had. I mean, yeah, you could get the disc from eBay, but there's still the DLC and the subscriptions and the season passes. So to really be a passionate player of a particular IP, I mean, you're going to have to invest tons of money. And I think a lot of these modern games, they don't want you to play 10 of them. They want you to play, whatever it is, Call of Duty. They want your attention. They're fighting for your singular devotion to whatever it is they're offering. Now, that's not to say that in 10 years, some hackers or some passionate players will kind of figure out a way, once these subscriptions are over, once these games die down, to somehow aggregate them in some form and let you play online for free and see everything they had to offer. But right now, that's unavailable, or it is incredibly expensive. One thing that comes to mind is a game called Genshin Impact. It's kind of a Chinese free-to-play game that seems to be popular in some circles. And on eBay, you see, oh, well, here's a character you can buy with, you don't have to grind. You can see the whole game. It has, the character has all the options. Oh, by the way, it's $1,000. So even if you're subverting the in-game economy, the cost of subversion is so high that you might as well just attach yourself to that economy if you like the game. Another thing that's interesting is that these services like Xbox Game Pass that do offer you a whole collection of games and do offer you backwards compatibility and a chance to play through the Xbox library, not fully, but at least as far as certain games and franchises, the corporation in that case is controlling your perspective. It's controlling how you enjoy the history of their console. They're determining, in a sense, what is in your collection and how long it stays there and how long you can play it. So, a kind of curated hyperfan perspective is possible, but you're paying for it and you lose control. And I think, the danger here is that you're going to lose the type of passion. You're going to lose the devotion that someone like this old woman had. Because I'll end by saying I do think that these models of economic subversion are central to being a super fan. They're kind of central to exploring your passion to its fullest. And they really, that, along with obviously other factors, but the ability to play so many games and to not be restricted by paywalls, to not be restricted by economic constraints, really allowed our culture to develop, and also similarly other fan cultures, whether it's baseball cards, comic books. At a certain point, you needed to consume these objects beyond economics to kind of get the perspective that founded these online circles of influence. So I wouldn't say that this is always going to be something on the margins. It's not for the mainstream necessarily, but I don't think it should be derided. I think this form of economic subversion is central to the passion that we all pursue.